Let's get started. So my name is, on the official world, is Dr. Ted Wiard. I'm a licensed therapist, I'm a certified grief counselor, and then I received my doctorate in leadership behaviors in the midst of change, organizational leadership, because I really wanted to see how leaders work with change. And within that, I spent a lot of time within the grief world and trauma world. I went out and worked at Betty Ford Center to show the parallel of grief, loss, recovery, addiction, recovery, and how those intertwine. So hopefully I can help with that. I am the founder and director of Golden Willow Retreat, which is an emotional healing center focused on grief and loss and trauma, where people actually come and stay with us. It's for people that need at least 30 days of sobriety. It's why I like working with Vista, because they're here along with me and Taos, and we have that chance to be able to help people if we find when they finish treatment they might need a little more time to work on trauma or loss and that grief process. So we work a lot in that field. And then also we're just open for anybody who's not feeling they're getting the quality of life that they're wanting. So we're really open to all different types of losses, and we receive people luckily from all over the world. We only allow 2 clients at a time or 1 family. So it's very, very individualized. So my information is up there. Also, just we need to collaborate. So know that. I'm also the founder and director of Golden Willow Counseling, which is a behavioral health center located here in Taos, which has regular good old therapy, outpatient therapy, as well as an intensive outpatient program for adults for alcohol and drugs. And then also we run the drug court for Northern New Mexico. Besides that, I'm also the clinical director for Rio Grande ATP, which is an adult drug and alcohol program. And I am the program director for grief, loss, and trauma at Southwestern College. So as my information shows, I am passionate about grief, loss, and mostly about emotional sobriety and being able to have that opportunity. So let's get started. Here's Golden Willow Retreat, located in Arroyo Hondo. Call Adriana if you ever have more information about it. I know Brandy's already thinking about coming out and staying with us just to check it out and see how they can help others. So it's located 7 miles north of Taos, and we have a little capilla, a little chapel that 10, 12-year-olds built. And so if you want more information, please let us know. I did write a small book called Witnessing Ted. I didn't pick that title. The Journey to Potential Through Grief and Loss. It's a 40-minute read on purpose. I felt it was everything that I couldn't find in the time of my different losses. So it seems to have been a good roadmap for many people. I'm not really pushing the book today because actually anyone who buys the book gives us money to give them out to others. It's not how I make my living, it's how I can continue to pass it forward. You can get it on Amazon, or if you're missing $15, send me an email and I'll send you one. So as we move into that, I did want to cover our objectives, and I wanted to make sure that we had a better understanding of that connection between trauma, loss, recovery, addiction, and all those different pieces. So I hope I can cover about a 3-day workshop in my 1 hour. So we also want to have a better I hope you guys each get a better understanding of what the brain and what happens with the brain due to trauma and loss and grief and addiction, and how the brain, just this amazing computer, works with us and sometimes doesn't work so well with us. And then just have an awareness of recovery, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Just going to take a second. Our world is in a tough place, and just have each of you, if you can read this, great. If you can't, whoopsie. But I'd just like to take a second. I know Shendo will be spending a little time on spirituality and just our closing today, but just realizing that finding truth through enlightenment and from recovery is not a simple process, and it doesn't mean everything is instant gratification. It's actually the opposite. And I want to say that because through emotional healing, it doesn't mean certain things don't still just suck. They're not still just a real drag. And And so grief is being able to help us redefine into the present so we're not caught in the past. It's not to fix the past, but from that, we can start to learn new ways to live and redefine into the present. So I'm just going to take a 30-second moment for everyone to take a breath. And hopefully that allows you to be here now, putting all the to-do lists away, allowing yourself a second. First of all, give yourselves kudos for all the work you're doing, but also for taking this time, having the bravery and strength to join this workshop and be here today. So I want to talk a little bit about what is addiction. And whoopsie, my computer likes to fly around today. And according to the American Medical Association, addiction is a chronic disease, meaning it gets worse and worse unless we do something about it, just like so many other diseases. I just think it's a really good way to remember that this isn't a just say no behavior. If someone truly has this disease, even the medical association says this is true. It's a whole different part that we're working with. It's not an individual disease, it's a family and community and societal disease. So we are seeing the undermining of this all the time. And also, addiction is when we have any behaviors that overrun our prefrontal cortex, that frontal part of our brain, and we're making decisions that deteriorate or hurt myself, my family, my profession, or my community, and I still do that. I've just always felt that's a good way of defining addictive behavior. What is recovery? According to SAMHSA, which a lot of us are involved with, substance abuse and mental health services and administration, recovery is that change, that process of change to improve our health and wellness and live a self-directed life and strive to reach one's full potential. And that's my strive. That's what keeps me alive. And if you can see the little picture there, we have the goldfish doing the miraculous job of recovery, of jumping from that comfortably miserable, usually unconscious even of that comfortably miserable, into potential. And it is a miracle. What is loss and what is grief? And I like to say this because in our world today, we have started to define loss really as death. And loss comes in so many different ways. And loss is any time that a person's foundation, their perception of reality, and illusion of safety has shifted, cracked, or shattered. In other words, that foundation I'm standing on has rocked, and all of a sudden I'm not as comfortable as I used to be, and things don't seem quite right, and I fall into that free fall. So loss comes in so many, many forms that we'll talk about in a little while. Grief is the process of change in a person's perception of reality that helps transform into the present time and place. In other words, I think this is so important, and I believe the audience today, even though I can't see you right now, you might know this, but we forget other people might not. And so grief and loss are not synonymous. They are actually very different. Grief and trauma and loss are all different. But grief is that process of where my world has changed and I have to redefine it into the present. And that's the big piece, what grief is. Loss comes in many forms: death, innocence, pets, self-control, divorce, addiction, even the loss of my drug of choice, as well as the loss of myself within that, geographical changes, financial changes, COVID, all these different pieces. It also includes things that we forget about, such as happy things, marriage, graduation, having a baby, because even in that, we go through a grief process to redefine ourselves into that present time and start to rebuild that foundation underneath our feet so that we can step forward. And loss is any time that we have that situation. I don't know what I wrote, but that's okay, because I have something else on the screen, but that's okay. So it's any time that we lose that piece of who we used to be. We actually die. And the illusion of safety is clinging on to the past while overwhelmed by the future. So the past and the future collide, and I'm in that free fall. And that happens deeply. I'll also be showing how that intertwines with relapse. When I have these losses in my life, it shakes my identity. It doesn't just shake how people see me, but everything from creationists to ethnicity to practices of habits, work, everything is questioned, and my identity is going out in this webbing of questioning all of those. And so my whole system is shaken. And I find myself lost, confused, unsure, unclear, perplexed, bewildered, disoriented in that free fall, which makes sense. As my brain starts to jump in, it tries to build from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, trying to just get that shelter, water, safety. This is really important as we talk about trauma. I can't do grief work if someone's in a trauma state. I have to start building that hierarchy. I need to start with, is there food needed? Is there shelter? Is there water, etc., before I can be like, so how do you feel about this? So we have to move from that hierarchy up through, and luckily, I believe so deeply, from loss, not sugarcoating, from loss, we can actually move to a higher level of self-actualization and move towards reaching our true potential. Let's talk about the brain for a little while. The brain is quite a wild animal that we keep trying to learn more about and keeps jumping in the way. I love the brain, just so you know. The brain, I think, is so amazing, and it's mostly trying to keep me alive. That's its number one issue, trying to move me out of discomfort and survive. The brain comes from the prefrontal cortex, what I'll be talking about, in the limbic system. Those are the two parts that I'm talking about today, because otherwise it's too complex and bigger than my little brain. But we're going to be talking about how loss and addiction and those two combine and how they impact the prefrontal cortex all the way down to the limbic system. Emotional and cognitive regression. When we have loss, we have regression. Our brain actually regresses back to a very young age. It's trying to figure out a way to start to move forward. But the first thing that happens is emotionally, I get yanked back to a very young age. Cognitively, I do as well. Whenever there's emotional escalation or dysregulation, it leads to cognitive decrease. So emotional escalation leads to that decrease in cognitive thinking. So quite often, I call it an emotional traumatic brain injury. I made that up, so it's a TEDism. I don't know what they'd see in the outer world, so if you do a fact check, I doubt that's what's going to come up, but it makes sense to me. When we have loss, our frontal lobe starts to turn off. And that frontal lobe, as it turns off, because it's going into the limbic system, and I'll back up for a minute. The limbic system is about fight, flight, freeze, fornicate, feast, and use. A viral chip called the disease of addiction jumps in there. And the limbic system is all about surviving the moment, fighting, running, freezing, trying to make a baby, trying to eat, or use my drug. And so in that process, as my frontal lobe turns off into safety land, there's certain things that come into play. And this is really important. When I got into my losses, which I'll talk about later, I wish I had known this. It would have meant I then could understand that I wasn't sick, I wasn't crazy, I wasn't alone, I was just confused and I was in the middle of a grief process and a trauma process. This would have given me some handholds of safety to go, oh, this is a natural, normal healing process. But as my frontal lobe shuts down and goes into survival mode, I have lost a short-term memory because I don't need it because my system thinks I'm dying, so it doesn't need to learn anything else. High impulsivity, so I can move quickly and jump around. Hypersensitivity. I feel like everyone's looking at me with a magnifying glass and I am naked and the sun is coming through that magnifying glass. And high irritability because I'm very hypersensitive, which means I need to be on edge so that I can fight, flight, freeze, fornicate, feast, or use. leading to a high level of confusion. The progression starts with the beginning. This is so intense, frequency, intensity, and duration for those behavioralists out there. And then I start to have healing, and then I plateau out, and then I'll have more growth again. And so we kind of do a process like this. I happen to call it scaffolding, so do a lot of other people, but we're moving into different healing processes. Within the limbic system, which is our survival mode that we need to be grateful for, we have these different pieces, and it makes up this whole part of my brain that keeps me alive, from the fight, flight, fornicate, feast. And so we move into these different parts of that limbic system, because truly, they finally proved it. I'm so psyched. 20 years ago, when I first gave a talk like this, I just say, this is what I believe. But now they've proved that truly that brain starts to shut down. And so then it's in this part. And so these parts start to happen. The amygdala plays a huge part, especially within trauma, because I start to have remembering and emotional experiences, and they can get locked in there. So the limbic is a huge piece of this process as my frontal lobe starts to go away. Back to the piece of emotional regression. As I get older, and so I happen to be 58 now, if I have a loss, I emotionally regress back to a very young age. My psyche is like, oh, good, this gives me a chance to heal any wounds that are still cellularly locked in there, or very lively locked in there. Because here is a piece I believe, our psyche doesn't hold a story, it holds an emotion. And then it goes up into my brain and tries to figure out what that is, which means any emotion that feels similar comes bubbling up. We'll talk more about that as I get into the boat later on, but emotionally I regress to a very young age. In the recovery world, this is a tough time, because as I emotionally regress, I look for an external rescue, which we'll also talk about. Cognitively, I also regress, because my brain is looking for anything in the past that helped me today, that helps me in this situation. So my buddy's dad, he killed himself when we were 12 years old. We stole 2 cases of beer. We went out to the truck and we drank the beer until we threw up. And then we got busted, and then we had to clean irrigation ditches, and we had to be grounded, and we had to repay the beer, and we were shamed, and all those wonderful things that cause other traumas. But my brain goes, you know what? I wasn't feeling that feeling for a minute. So in the relapse prevention world, when someone has loss, we try to help, and me for myself as well, within emotional sobriety, to go, no, that didn't really serve me. Let's find some things that actually serve me. So as a therapist that does a lot of work with grief, trauma, and relapse prevention, when there's a present loss, we watch this very closely, because the brain is trying to grab anything from my history that helps me in the present. Emotional regression leads to external blame in search of external rescue. This little goes from moving from that internal locus of control to an external locus of control, which also means all the other addictive tendencies. And there's a dance for dominance between the frontal lobe and the limbic system. The limbic system says I have to fight, flight, freeze, fornicate, feast, or use, and I don't care about much. While the frontal lobe's going, no, dude, we got to be kumbaya, and we got to reach out, and we've got to be creative, and we got to look at a bigger picture. And these two actually are fighting with one another, and they don't speak the same language, even though they're both in my brain and yours. And so here's where we start to have a lot of conflict. And as that emotionality goes up, and the serotonin increases, and there's a demand for dopamine, we're back into that limbic system, that situation leading to relapse or continuing addiction. So there's a fight going on, and the grief process hopefully helps build, as well as recovery, that the frontal lobe can be more dominant. We're not throwing either one out. We need both of them. But the frontal lobe can navigate my boat of life. Here's where I was just talking about the emotional guidance, that piece where emotionally I want to be moving into that frontal lobe. and moving up to joy and knowledge, empowerment, freedom, love, and appreciation. When I'm in that emotional spiral, I'm heading the other way. I'd disagree a little bit with this chart, with fear and grief being in there. Yes, fear can be there, but it's more panic, rage, depression, suicidality, powerlessness, and really down to futility. What I do like, if we go the upward spiral of healing, is we're rebuilding autonomy where we've lost autonomy from addiction or any other type of loss. I love our prefrontal cortex, and yet the prefrontal cortex gets all secondary knowledge. Our limbic system, all stimuli first goes into there. So it takes us to be able to be conscious enough to get to the parasympathetic and move up to the prefrontal cortex. And that's where our empathy lives, our insight, our response, our emotions. So when somebody is saying, just say no, that's from the prefrontal cortex. That's not from the limbic where addiction lives. If someone's saying, oh, in a loss or anything else, God just gives you what you can handle, you want to bop them in the nose because that's from the prefrontal cortex, not from the limbic system. So we have to rebuild the pathways up to that prefrontal cortex. This helps me as a professional as well as personally. I can consciously observe myself and hopefully come from a better place and come from that prefrontal cortex and be aware of when I'm in the limbic system. I try to help my clients do the same thing. Grief is a tough, scary journey. This is a sign I found outside of Gallup. And it's really enter at your own discretion. Open minds, unpredicted animals, methane, and anything else. There is so much resistance. And I happen to know by looking at the title, Brandy's going to be talking more on that resistance, which really excited me. So I won't say a whole lot on that, but there's resistance to do recovery. There's a lot of resistance to do recovery. In the loss world, if I think grief equals everything's okay, why would I do it? Instead, it's no, a fact on my lifeline might not be okay, but I can redefine myself and not be confined and defined by my past. It doesn't mean whatever's happened in my past is okay and no problem, no worries about it, but I can transform that into the present. So I choose to step into grief. It does take a community. Isolation is a very difficult piece that happens within loss. And we isolate, we retract, and we isolate. This happens to be my family long ago, and I'll be telling that story just here in a second. But it takes the individual and it takes the sanctity and dignity for someone to be able to be held, to have enough safety to step into that passage and journey for that healing process. So we need to help hold, and as professionals, I honor each one of you. Anytime we can hold that space where somebody does their work, so we can't do it for them, but when somebody can do their work, we get to move into that area of actually helping somebody without rescuing. Rescuing is perpetrating and it doesn't work, but we can hold that space. So it does take a community. We need to have the bravery to say, are you okay? I am here for you, which is different than, do you need anything? Because that just puts another thing on someone's plate. But having that door open. So just a little bit about me. This was my family back in about 1992. I can tell by the picture. And from that, my world started to change from this picture. Actually, a little bit before that. My brother Richard died in 1989, right before Amy was born. But I'm going to even go back a little bit further. In 1987, I almost died. Well, I actually died, left my body, then re-entered my body and lived. My brother Richard, while I was sitting there as a older 20-year-old saying, don't die, promise me you won't die. And I said, okay, because I thought I could have that kind of power. Luckily, I didn't die. But the following year, my brother Richard died in a shipwreck up in Alaska, which really woke up this journey. So from me almost dying, I went straight into the death of my brother Richard, who is a sweet, sweet man, young guy. But I really didn't get to do much about that because Richard died and Amy was born. And after Amy was born, we found out my wife Leslie had sarcomatoid renal cell carcinoma, which is cancer, sarcoma and carcinoma. And we were told she had 7 weeks to live. So we quickly got Amy baptized. We got to the hospital, and 5 days later, in which a 5-pound tumor was removed from her kidney, as well as 5 days after that, a tumor the size of a golf ball was removed from her forehead. So our world radically changed, and we were in a full state of trauma. I had gone from, this was actually 2 months earlier. I had gone from this wonderful woman who actually, just so you know, as her body deteriorated, she just glowed and became more and more beautiful. But a month after this picture, I had a wife who had no hair, staples across the top of her head, and staples from her chest down to her bikini line. So times had changed radically. She died. We released her ashes on the top of a mountain. And so here's my daughters and my dog Mai Tai. And all of a sudden we started a new journey. So all of a sudden it was me with these 2 awesome gals, and our life started to come back together. Now, it doesn't mean I braided their hair well, but I did. And they went to school and the teachers rebraided it. Sometimes I'd even put them to bed with their school clothes on and ask them not to pee the bed, and hoping we could start the next day because I didn't have enough time. I was overwhelmed. I was in my other loss, and I had no clue. All those other losses that had happened before that were never honored because I was too busy surviving the present loss. And so the 3 of us started our journey with our wonderful dog, Mai Tai. Well, 2 years after that, my daughter Amy and my daughter Carrie and my mother-in-law died in a car crash, and I was shattered. So this is little Amy Boo, and she died one day with her grandma Rachel. They died, and then 24 hours later, Carrie died in a car crash, and I found myself shattered. Up to this point, I had been a school teacher. School was starting the next week, so of course I didn't teach school, even though society was telling me that's what I should do because I could do it with my eyes closed, and I could do it with any 6th grader, but no, I couldn't. So I actually started a journey because I was so lost, a journey to find myself. And from that, I started to realize I needed help. I mostly just wanted to die, and I understood craving to a whole new level. My drug of choice, called my daughters, were gone, and there was no dealer. And I would, even today, do anything to get one more physical hit from them. Luckily, I get spiritual hits from them all the time. And even today, I made sure I have their pictures to the right of me to help hold me as I vulnerably share with all of you today. So I started a journey. In that process, as I continued to want to die and doing a lot of unconscious behaviors, trying to be rescued in many different ways, I checked myself into a treatment center for drugs and alcohol, even though that's not what I was doing. I've worked at Betty Ford and I've helped at many other centers, so I know in the assessment, when you come to a treatment center and knock on that door and you say, and they say, how many drugs do you use? And you say none. And how much alcohol do you drink? And you say none. Well, you knocked on that door, so you must be minimizing in line, so come on in. I'm so grateful they let me in the treatment center, and it was none of these treatment centers, by the way. That treatment center saved my life. I got to learn the 12 steps, and I had the holding that allowed me actually to start Golden Willow Retreat, but it gave me time. It was like a UFO had picked me up, put me on another planet, and now I had the chance to recover. From there, I went off to ministerial school because I couldn't figure out this God piece. And so from that destruction leading to that chaos, I started to reconstruct myself. There I met my present wife, Marcella, and one day she said, are you ever going to do that grief thing that you've always talked about? And so we came back to Taos from North Carolina and started Golden Willow Retreat to be able to do that piece. So I started to have purpose again. I started to get to build. I started to be creative with my mind. And so I started to rebuild a foundation of who I am today. Let's see. Oh, good. I still have enough time to get this in. I don't want to steal from Brandy because I'm looking forward to her talk so much. I like to talk about the boat of life. Please allow this to be a parallel of addiction because that's loss as well as loss itself of the other kinds. and the grief process. But in our life, we come into this world with a nice, beautiful boat, and we're this brand new baby. And then things start to happen. Well, even before things start to happen, they've finally shown research on this through the genomes. We actually come into this world with chromosomal changes from traumas from the past. So our DNA gets shifted around from historical losses. If you believe in past lives, you can go there as well. I have no problem with that. That's up to each person, so I don't even debate that. That's great any way someone believes. But scientifically, we can prove even before we're born, we've come in with certain losses within our chromosome due to genomes and the chromosomal change which happens from historical trauma. I'm going to back up for a minute. Even before we're born, pre-birth, mom may have used, mom may have been in a car crash, mom may have watched a scary movie, and I'm not blaming moms, it just happens to be where we're held during pregnancy. Maybe ate some bad beans and had gas, but inside I'm sitting there and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, and that foundation of who I was shifts, yet I'm not even born yet, and so I cellularly lock that stuff in. So even before birth, and then I'm born, and so that's pretty traumatic. All of a sudden I have to breathe and poop and eat for myself and start to learn my first false gods, usually my parents, to try to survive. And so all these losses and transitions are already happening, and my cells are keeping them. I'm having cellular lock. If you look up, if you don't know anything on Peter Levine, which is not Stephen Levine, who's the grief guru, but Peter Levine, about somatic release and somatic therapy, it's very, very interesting. Then I get a little bit older and I'm trying to survive this world. Maybe my pet has died. I'm doing so well. The preschool, they send me off to preschool and everyone's going, yay! And I'm going, no! Maybe there's abuse of any kind, possibly divorce, but there's still a lot of confusion. And these are in those early developmental years of 0 to 4. And so my brain is connecting these in, and it's actually already learning survival skills of how to deal with these. But the whole of my boat is pushing these in. Kids grieve differently than adults, which is a whole nother talk. But I'm just pushing these down the same way as I showed my personal story. Adolescence is adolescence. We all become hormonoids. Maybe there's abuse, maybe there's sexual issues, maybe I'm trying to figure out my identity. Maybe I'm already using personally. I have no problem, even though this is being recorded. I started smoking pot in 4th grade. I started stealing beer and drinking it in 3rd grade. So I was, for me, having older brothers means you just followed them. So in adolescence, so much is happening. Our body is radically changing, and we're pushing for individuation and autonomy from our parents and society, and we're trying to figure out who we are. We're also having many losses of who we were, the loss of innocence, which doesn't have to mean the loss of virginity, but the world's not as safe as I thought it was. Bullying can become a huge piece. I happen to work with many young ladies around 21, and as we look back at their life, let's see, I've had 11 now these are all people that are close to dying, and luckily they've all lived because of the amazing work they've done. All of them have been bullied as 10, 11, and 12-year-olds. So somehow that was a huge seed that they all had a commonality in of being bullied in that adolescent time period. And then we reach early teens and we have that puberty, and like I said, loss of virginity, loss of different types of innocence. We drive or we don't drive, we wreck the car, we don't wreck the car. School's always an intense piece. If we have a loss, so often it's how you doing in school. Well, as we said, the prefrontal cortex is turned off. I have no short-term memory. How am I supposed to put on a test what I just read if I can't remember the test? Our sexual identity. Possibly the law gets involved. All these different pieces as I'm trying to integrate into the world. And then we move on to the teens of love and hate and questioning, individuation, shame, guilt, and we just move into these different parts, but that whole of the boat continues to fill up. And then late teens, relationships, 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 and I could spend the whole hour saying that. Everything's trying to connect to that external world as my prefrontal cortex is starting to turn on, but really hasn't yet. So I'm still coming from, where are those external views? I get a little bit older, then I have all my secrets that I haven't shared, and they're sitting in there. I am a great believer of we are as sick as our deepest secret, and our deepest secret we probably don't know even ourselves. As we build the infrastructure, these can come up. As we share in treatment or therapy or with healthy friends, they're no longer secrets, and they can start to be healed because the Band-Aid is ripped off. We can now put light, warm water, love, healing, and all of a sudden we can have a scar of wisdom rather than a gaping wound. The boat continues to be filled, and then all of a sudden it is so full that we are stuck. As that happens, and so now we're in our 20s, the catalyst happens. We have some sort of loss that just takes us to that next level. And grief is overwhelming and daunting, and there's a lot of resistance. Actually, usually in grief or addiction, that's the relationship I know. In loss, it's usually anguish. And if I let go of that, I might not have anything. So there's great resistance, and it can be so overwhelming and daunting. And that's why we need support. And there may be a lot of people there to support, but it doesn't mean you don't feel totally alone and isolated. This was actually at my daughter's funerals, and there were 3,000 people. And I definitely was out of my body, and I definitely did not see any of these people that were giving me hugs. Kubler-Ross talks about the stages of grief. And within those stages of grief, one of her regrets is she called them stages rather than phases, because we move back and forth within these grief processes. There are actually more than 5, but somehow it slowly got narrowed down to the 5 stages of grief. I like to call them the 5 phases, and I actually came up with a few more. But I honor Kubler-Ross because she set that foundation for us then to grow and learn and more about this piece. She studied a lot about death and dying, and what she found is those phases happen, that person dies, and the bereft, the loved one, do the same phases in order to move into their new life. The same with addiction. We move to that place from pre-contemplative to contemplative to action to then maintenance. Doing those pieces, we move through those phases, and then we have to do the grief process just to be back and to redefine ourselves from whatever that loss is. Grief is a natural and normal healing process. It does not equal loss, and it doesn't equal instant gratification. So this is what I came up with, my 7. But I'd like to just scoot back. If we have that hole of the boat and we have a loss, that catalyst, it goes down into my psyche. But as it goes into my psyche and I do my emotional and cognitive regression, I start pulling all my past up. So I like to see it as an omelet. These are my eggs. So I crack in the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, the acceptance, the unknown, the relocation. I stir it all up, and then I reach into the hull of my boat and put in the chorizo and the chili and the cheese and the jalapenos and whatever else you want to put in there. So I can be nibbling on any of these at one time, or I might bite into that jalapeno and know exactly where I am. I'm going to go through these quickly, and just so you know, if you ever email me or anything, I have actually a bunch of YouTube on Ted Wiard YouTube or whatever that is. I didn't do it, but there's a whole talk just on this slide. But today we're going to go through it quickly. Please remember, this is like an omelet. I have to speak linearly. I can't speak holographically. So that's just the way it is. So please let your brain go holographic while I'm going linearly. Denial. Oh, first of all, also I had resistance to the words. Denial, anger. Denial I thought was lying. Anger I thought was a behavior I didn't even know was an emotion. Bargaining was some kind of gambling, and why would I bargain when I've already lost everything? Depression was something you didn't do or you had to take a pill. And acceptance, screw you. There's no way I can accept what's happened to me. And then I added the other 2. But what I had to do for my own brain, and you might play with, I had to come up with words where I could go in the back door of my resistance and move into this process. So I call denial insulation. And that's just giving me enough time for the information I have and my emotionality to realign. Happiness is the balance of joy and sorrow. And so when a loss happens, or I'm deep in addiction, or I move into recovery, these get very skewed. And so grief is that process of starting to bring them here. So we retract from our loss, and then we ebb in and we flow back. We ebb in and we flow back. In that process, I want to block my loss because I don't want to see it. And so as I flow out, my addictive tendencies show up, and I find different things to distract me. So this can be the start of addiction. That's a whole great debate that I love to be in. But it definitely leads to relapse, because all of a sudden, while I'm trying to pull away, all of a sudden, drugs, alcohol, sex, porn, internet, shopping, extreme actions, any of these pieces, rage, all of these pieces are trying to keep me from here. But as I remove my hand, there my loss still sits. I am a believer, as the people who put this together who know me, of recess. I do want to do my forward and back motion and lean into my losses and come back and back and forth. So I want recess. So I find healthy ways to have recess. I could always text Jeff, who's the director at Vista, and give him some smack and just have some fun and goofiness, and then go back to our seriousness. So we find ways to take a breath in the middle of that. That also includes many other pieces. But denial is that insulation that allows me to do this. Anger is protest. This sucks and it's not what I wanted. My chair even started to go down. And this is permissible. It might not even be what we think it is. It might not be at a person. It might not be at a drug. It might not be at God. It could be any of those things. It's just a protest. This is not what I wanted. Somatic release is what's happening here. And I actually see anger is crude oil that, when refined, actually becomes the passion later on for my work and reaching my potentiality. Bargaining is the shoulda, coulda, woulda. I wish I had done this. I could have done this. What if they had done this? What if they had done that? What if they had done that? So it's me being the director of my movie, not liking my loss and saying, cut, let's try this. What about this? And they don't have to make sense. I'm trying to put things in. And every time I hit that, I still have that loss. I'm chiseling at denial and stepping more into the present situation. Bargaining also has the garden of guilt and shame. Shame I define as should have already mastered everything, S-H-A-M-E, should have already mastered everything. And so that's a difficult piece. Guilt, I've done something bad. So shame, I am bad. Guilt, I've done something bad. I don't even like the words bad and good, but in this piece, this garden can get us in deep trouble. And then I bounce back up to denial and I relapse in whatever form or way. We need the permission to go through this process. My daughters died in a car crash. My mother-in-law ran a stop sign and they were hit by a trash truck. But my brain had to go through a very difficult process here. What's a dad's only job is to protect his children. I didn't protect my children, so I murdered them and I didn't deserve to live. Now, my brain had to go through this process and I had to find healthy and safe ways to have this be there. Otherwise, the Ted, that's not true, just made me feel smaller and smaller and smaller. So I had to find people who could hold that space while I did the alchemy of the rock tumbler within me, but still be held at the same time. So bargaining is a big, difficult piece. It's a huge contemplative place, and it's really a lot of the work takes place there. When I get into exhaustion of denial and bargaining, I move down to depression because I'm so tired. Now, in loss, it's situational depression. I'm sad. I surrender. I surrender to my old way. I surrender to I'm not who I used to be. So in other words, depression is that stairway that leads to acceptance, the acknowledgement of a fact. When I talk, for those of you out there that do therapy, I always have acceptance. I make sure I say that right away in areas because acceptance is the acknowledgement of a fact. It doesn't mean I accept it and everything's great. It's the acknowledgement of that fact. That's what Kubler-Ross came up with and worked with, and I continue to work with. I wasn't quite satisfied when I started Golden Willow Retreat because I was still alive. And I couldn't come up with a word, and here's where Shendo will help us as well. And I'm not that creative in this area, so my word was unknown because I didn't know. This is the area where grace, revived passion, trust, forgiveness, realization, spirituality, mindfulness, self-actualization happens. I don't believe we can do this. We can't say, Ted, you must forgive. My body is going to throw up those middle fingers, even to myself or to someone else. But through the grief process, this starts to happen. And I will tell you this, I had to forgive my mother-in-law. But it didn't happen because I had to. But through the grief process, 99.99% of the time, she's in my brain now, she's an incredible woman who made a horrendous mistake. Believe me, back when everything happened, that's not where I was at. But through the grief process and through my frontal lobe reopening up, I can now say that with honesty. In that process, we start to move to relocation, where we transition to a new norm. I say we move from the physical to the metaphysical, from the concrete to the abstract. Today, I still feel my girls. I say Leslie is the keel on my boat that Marcella, my present wife, and I get to play on. And I even have a rudder to help navigate my boat. I'm going to skip that. And so there happens to be phenomenological moments in sobriety, in rebirthing oneself. And we find those special moments and we can help people celebrate as well as ourselves. Our frontal lobe, those pathways start to reopen as the trees, like if it was a hurricane, and those freeways get to reopen and get to my frontal lobe. Plus, while it was shut down, I learned a lot of back roads so that I could get back up to that. And so we start finding those God shots that help those pathways reopen. And so that is how I really see that piece of grief, redefining from any type of loss. We start to know more about the brain. I think grief work is actually being aware and being a conscious observer of oneself. And in that, being seen, heard, and valued by myself, as well as healthy others who can hold that space, I start to rebuild and grow. Because most of you out there today are caregivers, I just love this piece of for a client or for myself, and I start to build that self-care plan. With most of us being in compassion fatigue, as well as COVID trauma fatigue, I think it's very important that we remember we take care of ourselves. In recovery, I like to think of God, me, family, then others, and I define family, by the way. But if that's in alignment, I can find emotional sobriety and move forward. I do believe all of us as professionals should find ways to stay in contact. I think we need to connect.